I watched the mule's legs fold as though some cord had been cut inside it, heard the dull thud of its body in the dust, and saw at its throat two neat black mouths where no bullet had passed. The air smelt of iron and wet stone, though the night was dry. Something moved just beyond the ring of lamplight, low to the ground, eyes catching the flame like damp glass. Men have pressed me, in clubs and drawing rooms, to speak plainly of what happened in Coahuila that summer. And I suppose age has made me careless of my own reputation. If you would hear more such accounts, lend your voice to this one, and tell me below which of our doomed little expeditions you might have joined. To understand that night by the dead mule, I must return to the beginning, to the heat and dust of June 1897, when we set out from Monterey with more confidence than sense. I was then 30 years of age, a junior surveyor attached to a commission sent north to assess grazing lands along the Mexican-Texan frontier. The railway speculators in Mexico City spoke of new lines and fenced pasture, and the papers printed anxious talk of some creature that had begun troubling the smallholders' goats. My superiors in London dismissed those reports as frontier superstition, but they were keen to know whether panic might disturb the cattle trade. Our little party numbered 5. Captain Arthur Henderson of the Royal Engineers commanded the survey, a spare, fair man with a habit of polishing his spectacles when he lied. Dr. Samuel Price, an American naturalist from Boston, came in the interest of a scientific society, hoping to catalogue birds and reptiles of the semi-arid plateau. There was myself, Edward Mallory, with my instruments and notebooks. We had also Senor Luis Ortega, a Mexican interpreter and guide whose family grazed stock near Saltillo, and a young vaquero named Miguel, who managed the pack animals and sang to them at night. We left Monterey on the 11th of June, traveling first by cart along the rough road towards Saltillo, then turning northwest into country that narrowed and emptied, the scrub giving way to low thorn and scattered mesquite. Our equipment was of the usual sort: 2 brass theodolites, compasses in their leather cases, field glasses, a box camera that Price cherished like a child, Winchester rifles, revolvers, canvas tents, and enough salt pork, beans, maize, and coffee for a month. We carried lanterns of tin and glass, and a pair of hurricane lamps for the wind. The first week passed in a manner almost tedious. We rose before dawn, drank the bitter coffee Miguel boiled, and moved out while the air was still bearable. By midday, the heat lay on us like a physical weight, and the horizon shimmered so that distant cattle seemed to float above the earth. Vultures circled high and slow. At dusk, we made camp near whatever water we could find, often no more than a muddy tank used by goats. It was on the 6th day, near the village of San Pedro de las Vacas, that we first heard the name the locals had for their unseen tormentor. A boy of perhaps 12 approached our camp as we were unpacking the instruments, his bare feet white with dust. He stared at our rifles. "You hunt it?" he asked Ortega in Spanish. "El Chupacabras?" Ortega laughed and cuffed him gently. "Go home, Niño. These gentlemen measure the land. They do not chase ghosts." Later, over beans and tortillas in a low adobe house, the village alcalde told us more. In the past month, he said, 23 goats and 4 sheep had been found dead in the pens at dawn, their bodies scarcely disturbed, their blood gone. No tracks, no torn wire, no sign of puma or dog. The men spoke of a thing that came without sound, that leapt, that drank. Henderson listened with the polite patience of a man indulging a child. "Most likely some thief among your neighbors," he said when we were alone. "Or a pack of feral dogs. Blood always looks missing when it is soaked into the ground." Price, I remember, was more circumspect. "The accounts are consistent," he said, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Puncture wounds to the neck. Very little disturbance of the carcass. It is unlike any predator I know." "You want it to be some new species," Henderson replied. "A beast to put your name to." Price smiled in that wry way of his. "I want only the truth, Captain, whatever shape it takes." That night we slept in the village, the men of San Pedro insisting that we share their hospitality. Miguel and I lay side by side beneath a thatched lean-to, the stars hard and white above us. He offered me a twisted cigarette, which I declined, and then, after a silence, he spoke. "Senor Mallory," he said, his voice low. "When I was small, my father told me of a thing that came to the goats. He said it was like a dog, but not a dog, long like this." He held his hands apart. "It walked on two legs when it wished. It had a tongue like a knife." I laughed, though I tried not to be unkind. "And what did your father do?" "He moved the goats," Miguel said simply. "Far from the place, some things you do not fight." He asked then about London, about the fog and the great buildings. I told him of the Thames and the bridges, of the lamps reflected on the water, and he listened with the same grave attention he had given his father's monster. "Before sleep took us," he said, "when this is finished, I will buy 3 more mules. My mother will not have to wash clothes for the soldiers." It was a small thing, that confidence, but it fixed him in my mind as more than a name in a ledger. The first oddity we ourselves observed came 2 days later, and at the time I thought little of it. We had moved farther north into country of low hills and shallow arroyos, where the soil grew stony and the scrub more sparse. Toward evening, we came upon a small rancho, its adobe walls half fallen, its corral empty. Ortega called out and received no answer. There were signs of recent occupation: a cooking pot blackened by fresh soot, a ragged blanket hung over a doorway to dry. Yet the goat's pen held only trampled earth and clumps of coarse hair. At the base of one post, I noticed a dark stain, already brown with age, and 2 small holes bored into the wood at the height of a goat's neck. I touched them and found the edges smooth, as if something hard had pressed there. "Wood-boring beetles," I said aloud, more to myself than to anyone. Price joined me, crouching. "Beetles do not work in pairs so neatly," he murmured. He bent and sniffed at the stain, then wrinkled his nose. "Blood, and not long dried. There is no stench of rot." We found no bodies, no bones, no sign of struggle. Only, as we were turning to leave, Miguel pointed to the dust just beyond the corral. There, for perhaps 6 or 8 paces, the ground bore a curious pattern. Impressions like those of a small hand with long fingers, set at intervals, as though some creature had moved with a bounding gait. After those few strides, the marks simply ceased upon bare earth, where no rock or root intervened. "Coati," Henderson suggested, "or some species of monkey escaped from a traveling menagerie." "In this country," Ortega said quietly. "No, senor." I remember that I felt then only a mild curiosity, as one does at any puzzle of the natural world. Had I understood the warning that lay in that abrupt disappearance of tracks, I would have argued more strenuously to turn back. Instead, we pressed on, north and east, following the line the Commission had drawn on its maps. As days passed, the reports grew more frequent. A shepherd whose entire flock had been struck over 3 successive nights, each morning revealing 3 or 4 animals lying stiff and pale, their wool unstained, their eyes dried to dull stones. A woman who swore she had seen, at the edge of her lantern's reach, a shape like a child hunched on all fours, its back bristling with spines that shivered in the light before it melted into the darkness. Always the same details recurred: the twin punctures at the neck, the absence of blood on the ground, the lack of tracks or broken fences. We measured, we sketched, we took notes. Price collected flies from the carcasses, hoping to determine how long they had lain. Henderson insisted that the culprit must be a man with a knife and a taste for mischief, perhaps some bandit seeking to drive the villagers away. "Fear is a useful tool," he said one evening as we sat around the small fire. The sky above was cloudless, the Milky Way like a chalk smear. If I wished to clear this country for cattle, I might invent such a thing myself. "You think the peasants cut their own animals' throats?" Price asked. "I think men are capable of anything where land is concerned," Henderson replied. He glanced at me. "You have seen the clearances in Scotland, Mallory. Ask the crofters what they think of their landlords." I had no answer to that, for I had seen it. We spent one long afternoon at a hacienda whose owner, a stout man named Don Rafael, had lost 6 milk cows in as many weeks. He walked us along the line of his pasture fence, the wire taut and unbroken, cursing under his breath in a mixture of Spanish and English. When we reached the place where the last cow had fallen, he stopped and pointed. The carcass lay on its side, already stiff, the hide dull. There was no bloating, no buzzing cloud of flies such as one would expect in that heat. The animal's eyes were sunk, the tongue blackened and swollen. At the neck, just above the dewlap, were 2 holes the diameter of a man's little finger, clean and round. No other wound was visible. Price knelt and pressed his hand to the flank. "Cold," he said. "Too cold. It cannot have been dead more than 3 hours, yet the flesh is as if it had lain all night in a cellar." I watched a thin trickle of dark fluid ooze from one of the punctures, sluggish and thick as molasses. When it reached the dust, it seemed to vanish rather than soak in. I touched the ground and found it dry. There is a rational explanation, I told myself, though I did not yet know what it might be. Perhaps some disease of the blood that caused rapid coagulation, some unknown fever. Price spoke of parasites, of venomous bats, of insects that might enter through a small wound and drink a beast dry. Henderson scoffed openly at these speculations. "It is a man," he said again as we rode away. "A man with a sharp tool and a cruel sense of humor. We shall catch him yet." The land itself seemed to grow more watchful as we advanced. The usual chatter of birds at dawn diminished, until some mornings we woke to a silence broken only by the creak of saddles and the distant bark of a dog. Once we came upon a shallow pond that stank of sulfur, its surface filmed with a strange iridescent sheen. No insect skimmed its water, no frog called from its edge. The air around it felt cooler by several degrees, though the sun beat down as fiercely as ever. At night there were sounds. At first I took them for coyotes or distant cattle, a thin, high keening that rose and fell on no pattern I recognized. Sometimes it seemed to come from very far away, sometimes from just beyond the nearest thorn tree. Once, as I lay half asleep, I heard what I thought was Miguel humming to the mules, a low, tuneless murmur. When I sat up, the sound ceased, and I saw his dark shape some yards away, his back turned, utterly still. The others heard it too, though we rarely spoke of it. Men who spend much time in the field learn not to give voice to every unease. Yet I noticed that Miguel began to keep the lanterns burning later, and that Ortega, who had at first laughed at the villagers' tales, grew quieter when the subject arose. It was around the 12th day that our rational explanations began to strain. We had made camp in a shallow arroyo, its sides offering some protection from the wind. The sky that evening was strangely veiled, as if a thin smoke lay between us and the stars. Price had set his box camera upon its tripod, hoping to capture some impression of the landscape in the moonlight, and was fussing with the plate holders. Henderson and I sat over the map, marking the day's progress. Suddenly, from the darkness beyond the lip of the arroyo, there came a sound like a goat's bleat abruptly cut short, as if a hand had closed around its throat. It was followed by 3 rapid thumps, soft but distinct, as though something heavy had landed and then bounded away. Miguel was on his feet at once, rifle in hand. Ortega swore softly. The mules shifted and snorted, their eyes rolling white in the lantern light. "It is nothing," Henderson said, though his voice lacked conviction. "A coyote taking its prey, that is all." Price, who had gone pale, licked his lips. "That was very near," he said. "We should look." Against my better judgment, and perhaps because my pride balked at being thought timid, I volunteered to accompany him. We climbed the sandy bank, lantern held high, the rifle heavy in my other hand. The night air felt oddly thick, as if one breathed through damp cloth. The usual chorus of insects was absent. Our boots made too much noise. We found the goat not 20 yards from camp. It lay on its side among the sparse grass, its limbs rigid, its head twisted at an unnatural angle. There was no blood about it, no torn flesh, only the now familiar twin punctures at the neck. Its eyes, still open, reflected the lantern light with a dead, glassy sheen. The body was cold to the touch. "It cannot have died so quickly," I said, though I knew nothing of goats beyond what any townsman does. "There should be warmth yet." Price did not answer. He was staring at the ground around the carcass. I followed his gaze and saw, in a circle of perhaps 10 feet radius, a peculiar pattern in the dust. It was as if a multitude of fine lines had been drawn there, crossing and recrossing, like the tracery left by some enormous insect's legs. At the center, near the goat's hindquarters, the lines were deepest, as though something had stood there and shifted its weight. Then, as we watched, one of those furrows changed. The dust along its length shivered, very slightly, as if disturbed by a breath. A faint, sour odor reached us like that of damp stone and stale blood. Price took an involuntary step back. "Do you feel that?" he whispered. I did. The air seemed to press inward, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The hair on my arms lifted beneath my sleeves. A moment later, the sensation passed, and with it the faint smell. The dust lay smooth and undisturbed. We returned to camp more quickly than dignity strictly required. Henderson listened to our account with a frown. "Wind," he said at last. "A stray current. You are both overwrought. Take some brandy and sleep." Yet he doubled the watch that night, and I noticed that he kept his rifle within arm's reach as he lay down. It was around this time that the first of our instruments failed in an inexplicable way. The compass I had used since my training, a sturdy brass piece that had survived damp and heat on 3 continents, began one afternoon to tremble in my hand. The needle quivered and swung, not toward any fixed point, but in slow, irregular arcs, as if drawn by some wandering magnet. I checked it against Henderson's and found his steady and true. "Old age," he said, handing it back. "Or perhaps you have knocked it about more than you realized." I accepted this because there was nothing else to do. But that night, I found myself lying awake, turning the faulty compass over and over, listening to the faint, high sounds that threaded through the dark like threads of glass. The days grew hotter. The scrub thinned further, giving way in places to bare, pale earth that cracked like pottery. We rationed our water more strictly. The men spoke less. It seemed to me that the land itself was emptying of life. Once, in the distance, I saw a small herd of cattle moving at a trot, their heads low, as if fleeing some unseen pursuer. No rider followed them. It was on the 17th day that the thing we had been circling without naming reached out and touched us in earnest. We had established a temporary camp near a cluster of low hills, where a trickle of water seeped from a rock face into a shallow pool. It was poor stuff, brackish and tinged with an odd metallic tang, but better than nothing. We intended to remain there 2 nights while I completed a series of measurements and Price collected specimens. The first day passed without incident, save for a curious reluctance on the part of the mules to approach the water. Miguel had to drag them by their halters, cursing under his breath. When at last they drank, they did so in short, nervous bursts, lifting their heads frequently to stare at the surrounding scrub. That evening, as the sun sank and the shadows lengthened, a wind rose from the east, bringing with it a smell I had by then come to dread, a faint, sour musk, underlain by the coppery tang of blood. The air cooled rapidly, more than could be accounted for by the setting sun. I drew my coat tighter about me and saw my breath plume faintly before my face, though the day had been in the high 90s. "Cold front," Henderson muttered, though there was not a cloud in the sky. We ate in near silence. Miguel did not sing to the mules. Ortega, usually quick with some jest, stared into the fire and twisted his rosary between his fingers. When at last we lay down, the stars seemed unnaturally bright, as if the darkness between them had deepened. I do not know how long I slept. I remember only that I woke with the sensation that someone had called my name, very softly, directly into my ear. I sat up, heart hammering, and found the camp bathed in a pale, colourless light. For a moment I thought it was dawn, but then I saw the moon, high and small, and understood that some thin mist had risen, diffusing its glow. The fire had burned down to embers. Henderson lay on his side, back to me, his breathing slow and regular. Price's blanket was empty. I heard then a sound that froze me more completely than any cold could have done. It was a low, rhythmic sucking, wet and intimate, like a man drawing marrow from a bone. It came from beyond the circle of bedrolls, near where the mules were tethered. I reached blindly for my revolver, fingers clumsy, and rose as quietly as I could. Each movement seemed to take an age. The mist thickened as I stepped away from the fire, beading on my lashes. The sucking sound continued, unhurried. As I drew nearer, another sound joined it. A faint, high whine, almost a whistle, that rose and fell in a pattern that set my teeth on edge. It was not any animal call I knew, It seemed, in some obscene way, to mimic the cadence of human speech without forming words. I stopped at the edge of the lantern's last reach. The pale light showed me the nearest mule, its head hanging low, its flanks heaving. Beyond it, half obscured by its body, was a hunched shape low to the ground. Its back arched like that of a cat at a saucer of milk. I could not see its head, only the curve of its spine, along which ran a series of raised ridges or spines that trembled with each movement. The sucking ceased. The hunched shape went utterly still. The mule's eyes rolled toward me, wide and white, the whites veined with red. Its lips twitched soundlessly. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then, with a speed that seemed impossible, the thing straightened and turned. I saw only fragments, as if through the shutter of Price's camera. A head too large for the narrow shoulders, set on a long, sinewy neck. Eyes that caught the lantern light not with the flat reflection of an animal, but with a depth that suggested some colder, more deliberate awareness. A mouth that opened wider than any dog's, revealing not rows of teeth, but two long, pale structures like blades, slick with dark fluid. Its forelimbs were long and thin, ending not in paws, but in something like hands, each finger tipped with a curved black claw. The hindquarters were powerful, the legs jointed oddly, as if made for leaping. The skin, where it showed between sparse, coarse hair, was the color of old parchment. It regarded me for what may have been only a second, but felt like an eternity. In that gaze, I felt no animal panic, no simple hunger. There was instead a kind of cold appraisal, as if it weighed me, measured me, and found me wanting. Then the mule screamed, a hoarse, bubbling sound, and collapsed as if some vital support within it had been withdrawn. At the same instant, the thing moved. It did not run as any quadruped I have known, but seemed to fold and unfold itself, springing sideways and backward in a series of low, fluid bounds that carried it out of the lantern's reach and into the mist. The air where it had been smelt strongly of musk and iron. I fired twice, more from reflex than aim, the shots deafening in the stillness. Sparks flew from a distant rock face. There was no answering cry. Men shouted behind me. Henderson's hand was on my shoulder, dragging me back. The mules thrashed and snorted, one tearing its tether free and bolting into the dark. Ortega was crossing himself, rapid and clumsy. Miguel, his face ashen, held a lantern aloft, its light trembling. On the ground before us, the mule I had seen fall lay on its side, legs twitching in the last reflexes of life. At its throat were two gaping wounds, larger than those we had seen on goats and cattle, the edges ragged yet oddly clean. Dark blood welled up for a moment, then slowed, then stopped, as if some unseen pump had been switched off. Within minutes, the flesh felt cold. Of Price, there was no sign. We searched until dawn, calling his name until our voices were hoarse. The mist clung low to the ground, thinning only as the first light touched the eastern sky. At last, some distance from camp, we found his camera, overturned, the glass plate within shattered. Beside it lay his hat, crushed into the dust. There were no footprints leading away, no drag marks, no blood. The earth might never have known he had stood there. Henderson's jaw worked as he stared at the empty ground. "He has gone to fetch water," he said at last, though the pool lay in the opposite direction. "He will return." "He would not leave his camera," I said, hearing the thinness in my own voice. Ortega knelt and touched the dust where the hat had lain. He lifted his hand and showed it to us. The skin of his palm was beaded with a fine moisture, as if he had pressed it to cold stone. "Our key," he said softly. "It was here, whatever it is." We waited the rest of that day and the following night in a state I can only describe as suspended terror. Every rustle of scrub, every distant cry set our nerves on edge. The air around the pool remained unnaturally cool. No bird came to drink. By the second morning, Henderson's denial had frayed. "We cannot remain," he said, his voice hoarse with lack of sleep. "We must return to Monterey and report. If Price is alive, he will have gone to some other habitation. We may yet find him on the road." Miguel said nothing, but the set of his jaw told me he did not believe this. I, torn between loyalty to the captain and a growing conviction that the land itself wished us gone, sided with departure. Ortega muttered a prayer of thanks under his breath. We broke camp with a haste that bordered on panic. The mules were skittish and balked at every shadow. One had to be abandoned when it refused utterly to move. Its eyes rolled and its flanks quivered whenever we attempted to lead it. As we left it, standing there, alone by the pool, it made a low, desolate sound that I can still hear if I wake in the small hours. The journey back should, by simple measure of distance, have taken us 5 days. It took 9. Our progress was slowed not only by the loss of one pack animal, but by a series of small, unnerving incidents that sapped our strength and will. On the second day, as we passed a shallow ravine, Miguel's horse stumbled and nearly fell. When we dismounted to lead the animals across, we saw beneath a thin layer of dust a scattering of bones. They were small, perhaps those of goats or sheep, and had been picked so clean that they shone pale as porcelain. There were no skulls among them. The air in the ravine was several degrees cooler than the surrounding plain. On the 4th night, we camped near a cluster of boulders that offered some shelter from the wind. The sky was overcast, the stars veiled. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of whispering. It seemed to come from just beyond the ring of stones, a soft susurration in a language I did not know. I lay rigid, every muscle taut, and listened. The voices rose and fell in a strange cadence, like the high whine I had heard by the mule, but more complex, almost conversational. I forced myself to look. Beyond the boulders, the darkness was absolute. I could see nothing. The whispering continued for several minutes, then ceased abruptly, as if some unseen speaker had been interrupted. A moment later, there came a faint, moist sound, like a tongue withdrawing from a wound. The next morning, when I mentioned this to Henderson, he stared at me with bloodshot eyes. "We are tired," he said. "Our minds play tricks. Say nothing of this when we make our report." Ortega, overhearing, shook his head. "It is not tricks," he murmured. "It is calling. It called Senor Price, and he went." Miguel, who had been silent since the night of the mule, spoke then for the first time in hours. "We should have left when the old men told us," he said. "They said the land is sick. They said something came up from under the stones when the wells were dug too deep." I asked him, though I almost wished not to know, what exactly they had said this something was. He met my gaze with a steadiness that belied his years. "They said it was here before the goats," he replied. "Before the cows, before the men. It slept. Now it wakes when it smells blood." After that, there was little talk. As we drew nearer to settled country, the signs of ordinary life returned. Smoke from distant chimneys, the faint clanging of a bell, the bark of dogs. Yet even there, the rumors of the thing we had half seen had preceded us. At a small village where we stopped for water, the women crossed themselves when they saw the state of our party, and one old man spat on the ground and muttered, "Chupacabras," as if it were a curse. We reached Monterey on the evening of the 29th day after our departure. The city, with its gas lamps and tram cars and the distant clatter of the rail yard, seemed almost unreal after the stark, watchful silence of the plateau. As we led our weary animals through the streets toward the quarters assigned us by the Commission, I felt a peculiar dislocation, as if I had stepped from one world into another without any true boundary between them. The director of the survey, a portly gentleman named Sir Henry Caldwell, received us in his office the next morning. He listened to Henderson's account with a furrowed brow, his fingers steepled. When the captain came to the matter of Price's disappearance, Sir Henry's expression shifted from concern to something like irritation. "You are telling me," he said, "that a member of this expedition vanished in the night, leaving no trace, and that you have no explanation to offer beyond the tales of superstitious peasants?" Henderson's jaw clenched. "I am telling you what occurred," he replied. "We searched. There were no tracks, no signs of struggle. We heard sounds. We observed certain peculiarities in the dead livestock along our route. Dr. Price himself took extensive notes. They are in his pack." Sir Henry glanced at me. "And you, Mr. Mallory, do you corroborate this account?" I hesitated, feeling the weight of my own reputation, the expectations of my superiors, the memory of that cold, appraising gaze in the lantern light. In that pause lay the choice between truth as I had seen it and the truth the world would accept. "I corroborate the facts as Captain Henderson has stated them," I said at last. "As for the cause, I can offer no certain explanation." Sir Henry exhaled through his nose. "Very well. You will prepare a written report, omitting any mention of monsters or goblins. We shall attribute the livestock deaths to some unknown disease, and Dr. Price's unfortunate loss to a fall in rough country. The American consulate will accept that more readily than tales of blood-drinking beasts." There was no sign of a fall. I began, then stopped. Sir Henry's gaze was cool, his meaning unmistakable. Later, alone at my small desk, I attempted to reconcile what I had seen with what I was prepared to set down in the official record. The language of such documents is dry by design, a litany of distances, bearings, elevations, and observed phenomena. How was I to describe the way the air itself had thickened, the unnatural cold, the smell that clung to my clothes? There is no column for that in a surveyor's table. In the end, the report we submitted spoke of unexplained exsanguination of livestock, of anomalous absence of predation marks, of the disappearance, presumed accidental, of Dr. Samuel Price during nocturnal hours. It mentioned unusual chill and olfactory disturbance in certain localized areas, but couched these in terms of meteorological curiosity. Nowhere did the word chupacabras appear. The document was filed, stamped, and, I am told, forwarded to the appropriate offices in London and Mexico City. I later saw a brief notice in a scientific journal summarizing our findings and suggesting that some hitherto unknown blood-borne pathogen might be responsible for the livestock deaths. The disappearance of Price was relegated to a footnote. Of the other truth, The one that woke me sweating in the night, there was no trace. Years passed. I returned to England, married, took up a position with a firm that surveyed rail routes in India and Africa. Life, as it does, filled with other concerns, contracts, children, the slow accretion of domestic habits. Yet the memory of that cold pool, of the mule's collapsing legs, of the thing that unfolded itself from the shadows, did not fade. If anything, it grew more vivid, as if the mind, in turning an object over and over, polishes it to a terrible clarity. There were certain triggers that brought it back with particular force. In the winter of 1903, walking home along the embankment one foggy evening, I passed a butcher's stall where a side of beef hung, its blood pooling darkly on the stones. The smell of iron and raw flesh struck me, and for a moment, the London street vanished. I was again in that pale, misted camp, the air too cold, the lantern light trembling. I stood there, gripping the rail, until a costermonger jostled me and muttered an apology. Another time, years later, my eldest son brought home a book of folk tales from the library, excited to show me an illustration of a dragon. As he turned the pages, a woodcut caught my eye, a depiction of some medieval creature said to haunt the marshes, its back bristling with spines, its mouth wide and fanged. The artist's hand was clumsy, the proportions wrong, yet something in the posture, in the way it hunched over a fallen sheep, made my heart stutter. "Do you know that one, Father?" my son asked. "No," I lied, closing the book perhaps more quickly than was kind. "It is only a story." Sleep, which had once come easily to me after a day's labor, grew more elusive. I would lie awake, listening to the small noises of the house, the creak of settling timbers, the faint rustle of the curtains in a draught, and hear in them echoes of that high, whining cadence beyond the fire. On more than one occasion, my wife woke to find me standing at the window, staring out into the dark garden, as if expecting to see something move among the shrubs. "Is it India that troubles you?" she asked once, gently. "Or Africa?" "It is older than that," I almost said, but instead murmured something about the usual worries of work. How could I tell her that what haunted me was not the memory of men or wars, but of something that had never appeared in any dispatch? I tried, in my fashion, to investigate, though there was little to go on. In the reading room of the British Museum, I sought out accounts of unusual animal attacks, of unexplained exsanguination, of creatures said to drink blood. There were plenty of vampire tales, of course, from Eastern Europe and elsewhere, but these were steeped in human superstition, their monsters too closely tied to the dead. I found a few references, in obscure Spanish and Portuguese texts, to cabras sangradas and bestias de la sangre in the Americas, but nothing that matched exactly what we had seen. Once, in 1909, I received a letter from Henderson, then retired and living in a small town in Devon. His hand had grown shaky, but his mind, as the words showed, remained sharp. After some pleasantries about the weather and mutual acquaintances, he wrote, "I have lately seen in a London paper some mention of renewed vampire attacks upon goats in the Mexican north." The writer, with that mixture of credulity and condescension peculiar to journalists, spoke of the Chupacabras as if it were a comic invention. I confess, I felt a peculiar chill upon reading the word. Do you ever think of that summer? I find that I do, more often than is comfortable. I wonder sometimes whether we did right in how we reported it. I sat with that letter for a long time before replying. When at last I took up my pen, I wrote, "I think of it frequently. As for whether we did right, I can only say that I do not know what alternative was available to us. Had we spoken plainly, we should have been dismissed as hysterics or drunkards. Perhaps we were cowards. Perhaps we were simply men of our time, bound by its expectations of reason. In any case, the thing we saw does not depend upon our words for its existence." Henderson's answer, when it came, was brief. "You are correct," he wrote. "It does not. I wake at night hearing that sound, and I am an old man." We never spoke of it again. He died 2 years later of a stroke in his sleep, his obituary making much of his service and nothing of the expedition that had marked him more than any campaign. Of Ortega and Miguel, I heard only once more. In 1912, a letter reached me from a lawyer in Monterrey, informing me that Señor Luis Ortega had died, and that in his effects there was found a small packet addressed to Don Eduardo Mallory, surveyor. Inside was a folded sheet of paper and a small, smooth stone. The paper bore a few lines in Ortega's hand. "Friend," it read, "I do not know if this will find you. I write to tell you that the thing is still here. Last year, near San Pedro, 10 goats were found as before. The men talk of it more quietly now, but they still talk. Miguel says he has seen its shadow on the hill. He will not leave this land. He says, if it must have blood, it will take his before his mother's. I tell him he is a fool. Perhaps we are all fools. This stone is from the pool where we camped. When I hold it, my hand grows cold. I send it to you so that you will know it was not a dream." The stone, when I touched it, did indeed feel colder than the air of my study, though it had travelled thousands of miles. I placed it in a drawer and, for years, avoided opening that drawer without necessity. Once, in a moment of what I can only call morbid curiosity, I took the stone out and pressed it to my wrist. The skin beneath it prickled. A faint metallic odour rose, though whether from the stone or from my memory, I could not say. I held it there until my hand began to ache with a chill, then put it away again. There were times when I considered returning. The idea would come to me in the small hours, unbidden, that I might go back to Coahuila, to that cluster of low hills, to the pool, and see with the eyes of an older man what the younger had missed. Perhaps I might bring some new instrument, some device of modern science to measure the cold, the smell, the sound. Perhaps I might prove once and for all that what we had encountered was some rare, misapprehended animal, a creature of flesh and blood and bone, no more uncanny than a giant squid or a gorilla had once seemed. Each time, daylight and reason intervened. What would I say to my family, to my employers? What would I do if I found nothing? Worse, what would I do if I found something and it looked at me again with that flat, measuring gaze? There are questions that can be lived with only so long as they remain unanswered. Now, in the autumn of my life, I find that my attitude to that summer has shifted once more. Where once I raged inwardly at the inadequacy of our report, at the world's willingness to explain away what does not fit its categories, I feel instead a kind of weary acceptance. The universe is under no obligation to present itself in forms we can catalogue. There are, I am persuaded, things that move at the edges of our understanding, indifferent to our need to name and classify. What troubles me most, even now, is not the sight of the thing itself, though that was terrible enough. It is, rather a smaller, more intimate detail. The way the mule's legs folded, not in the spasmodic collapse of a creature struck by a bullet, but as if some inner tension had been released, some vital thread cut. It is the sound that accompanied that collapse, a faint, wet withdrawal, like lips leaving a wound. Sometimes, when the house is quiet and the fire has burned low, I sit and listen. The ordinary noises of life go on, the ticking of the clock, the distant rumble of a cart in the street, the murmur of voices from another room. Yet beneath them, if I attend closely, I fancy I can hear another sound, very far off, very faint, a high, thin whine that rises and falls in a pattern that is almost, but not quite, like speech. On such nights, I think of the goats in San Pedro, of Don Rafael's cows, of the nameless animals whose bones we trod upon in that ravine. I think of the villagers who still, perhaps, wake to find their pens too quiet, their animals lying pale and cold with no blood on the ground. I think of the stone in my drawer and of the fact that, whatever name men give it, whatever stories they tell, something in that land continues to feed. And in the small hours when sleep will not come, I find my mind returning, unbidden, to that one fixed image, the circle of lamplight in the Coahuila night, the dust pale as bone, and just beyond its edge, where the light fails and the dark begins, the glint of two eyes at the height of a man's knee, watching, unhurried, waiting for the next soft fall of hooves